log on. So thanks everyone for joining us today for the launch of Australian Perspectives on Misinformation. My name is Professor Jason Bainbridge, I'm Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Design here at the University of Canberra. It's my great privilege to be launching the report today, and it's good to see so many of you in those Brady Bunch squares online. It's hard to imagine a more timely issue than misinformation, particularly given the real-time example that's currently playing out for us in the United States. As I say in the foreword, the production and distribution of misleading information connects individual news consumers, media outlets, online platforms, extremist groups, and foreign governments in ever increasingly tangled webs. Such a complex phenomenon can only be approached by bringing together a range of diverse perspectives. And Australian Perspectives on Misinformation, the Critical Conversations Lab's inaugural report, showcases just such a wide array of points of view, highlighting the lab's networked approach to the research process. The Critical Conversations Lab was established in 2019 within the News and Media Research Centre here at UC. Led by Matthew, it investigates how issues of social and political concern emerge through media networks to enable public participation and influence the political agenda. The seeds for this report were first planted in 2018, when Matthew organised a misinformation and media symposium at UC, subtitled Understanding the Spread of Misinformation in the Australian and US Media Fields. How prescient that seems now. In addition to Matthew and Mike, symposium participants included the ANU's Rob Ackland and Axel Bruns from the Queensland University of Technology's Digital Media Research Centre. All these researchers, as well as Axel's QUT colleague Tim Graham, are featured in this report. Similarly, Matthew contributed to the creation of the Virtual Observatory for the study of online networks, a global e-research hub led by Rob at the ANU. Rob's computational methods were used to track and analyse the strange behaviour of Russian trolls on Australian Twitter, as detailed in Chapter 2 of this report. Ultimately, the report shows that the use of misleading information for political purposes is not new. 20th century totalitarian regimes regularly use the manipulation of facts and images to maintain their grip on power. But at the time of COVID-19, when anyone can produce and spread misinformation online, it is particularly important to get the facts right. And the Australian Perspectives on Misinformation report proposes common sense media literacy techniques to help prevent the spread of misinformation, as well as a series of experimental steps to reach out to conspiracy believers. I want to extend my congratulations to Matthew and Mike, to G, Chris, Robert, Axel, Tim and Kelsey, and it is my great pleasure to officially launch the NMRC Critical Conversations Lab's inaugural report, Australian Perspectives on Misinformation today. I'll now pass over to Matthew to run us through some elements of the report in more detail. Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Jason. So we've got a really limited amount of time. So what I thought I'd do is I'd go over some of the key points for the next 8 to 10 minutes, and that should leave us about 15 minutes for Q&A. And, you know, we have many of the participants and the contributors in the report here: Axel, Rob, Kelsey, Timothy, Tim. I'm going to try and share my screen with a PDF, which is a new thing for me. So let me just try and view full screen mode. Can you see this? Yep, everybody got that? So I'm really happy with this report because it brings together a lot of researchers that I've been working with or that I've known for a long time, as well as some journalists. Misinformation is obviously a very complex phenomenon and needs to be approached from interdisciplinary perspectives and also from different kind of epistemological perspectives or different angles. And the report is very diverse. You know, every chapter is very different, has a very different sort of methodological perspective. So there's elements of political science, critical sociology, communication, computational, social science, etc. Okay, so I'm going to go really quickly. I apologize, but once again, we really have very little time. So the first chapter basically deals with a reanalysis of the digital news report led by Sora at the News and Media Research Centre, which tracks Australians' perceptions of news and consumption of news. So we just heard from Michael Sokolow about the extraordinarily polarized situation in the United States, where people have basically different interpretations of what is real, of what is reality. And I think in Australia, there are the seeds for that to happen. And obviously we have a completely different political system here. You know, there's compulsory voting, there's a strong public broadcaster, so it's a completely different situation than in the US, but there are some elements of polarization in Australia between old people, younger people, between urban residents and regional residents, for example, between left-wing, quote unquote, and right-wing people. I think the most worrying trend is the continuing distrust or decline of trust in the news, which, you know, a point that was made by Mike, my co-author, is that it would be interesting to explore further the relationship between the apparent rise of trust in my news, the news that I consume, versus the decline in trust in the news, which is the news that everyone consumes. But the problem is with these categories, we're not quite sure what people mean by them. So I think there needs to be a little bit more work in the DNR maybe to clarify those categories. But I think that basically, if people start believing my news, the news they select, versus, you know, that opens the door potentially for the rise of misinformed sources of information becoming relied on more. Okay, so here you have some of the impact of COVID-19, which is from another report that the News and Media Research Centre did. And the trust in the news actually rose in Australia during COVID-19. So people were more, more ready to believe authorities during COVID-19. Yeah, so the big divide is between generations. I'm not going to go over this too much, but just want to say there's an interesting figure, which is, okay, so I mean, for example, you know, source of misinformation by political orientation, you know, right-wing people, we find that, you know, think activists are going to create misinformation. Left-wing people think it's more government, things like that. So, you know, what you'd expect. But I just wanted to see, oh yeah, verification, figure 113. This is about who fact checks the most. And so what we observe throughout this chapter is there's a divide between baby boomers, people born before 65, and the younger generation, Generation Z, people born after 97. Generation Z during COVID tended to fact check the most, but they also use social media the most, and they're also more likely to share stuff that they don't think might be true. So, you know, these are mixed results, but there's definitely polarization happening in Australia according to one's demographic characteristics. We have three invited comments in this chapter, in this report. So Chris Sapone from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, he sees news media as part of a network with other actors these days. In contrast, for Axel Brandts and Tim Graham from the Digital Media Research Centre at QUT, they see very much that the elites, you know, political elites, news elites play a role in spreading misinformation. How would misinformation about COVID spread from the communities online to mainstream if there wasn't a transmission? So he questions the definition of filter bubbles and echo chambers. I'll come back to this in a minute, and I'm not going to talk any more about those comments because I don't have time, but people can ask me questions. So here's 6 easy media literacy steps that we propose. Just, you know, very sensible, common sense things. Don't share content you haven't actually read. Twitter's actually doing that now. You know, they ask you, do you want to read the article? Beware of ad hominem attacks. You know, if you're attacking, there's an attack on somebody who, you know, who's interested in being served, etc., etc. Okay, second chapter is about the internet research campaigns in 2016. So Twitter released a very a big data set with the State Department of troll accounts. And Rob used the data set he created at the ANU as part of Voicon to map troll activity on Australian Twitter. And so we submitted this to a Senate committee on foreign interference through social media. We appeared twice in front of that committee, and we found some really interesting activity. It wasn't very extensive, like there wasn't a lot of it, but it was just brilliantly weird. So one of the things they did was, for example, try and connect, and I won't go into the methods. If there's questions about the methods, Rob can address those because I don't have time once again. So what these troll accounts were doing, were trying to sow division in society by making connections that no one else was making. For example, in the discussion around refugees, Nauru, Manus Island, they introduced the term ISIS, and there was the only account that made an equation between refugees and Islamic State, trying to create an us versus them kind of thing. So another troll that we found, the one that contributed the most, and I need to say a quick word about troll detection. Usually you can detect trolls by the speed of their actions or the volume of their actions. They're very high volume, very high speed, or because their bios are not, reliable, or they're incredible. But another thing is, you tell people don't retweet stuff that you don't know, or don't share stuff that you don't know the origin. And so this troll, the bad vibe troll, we called him, I should say, only retweeted stories from the media and hashtag environment, hashtag this, hashtag that. They're all bad news stories. So basically, it was an exercise to depress morale. It doesn't work so much in a place where there's compulsory voting, but you can imagine what it's like in places where there's no compulsory voting. People just stop feeling there's any point in participating in institutions. Okay. The third chapter, so we had a survey method in the first chapter, survey data, computational methods in the second one, and the third one is an interview with Kelsey, who's an ABC digital journalist who interviewed me in May. She found me online about this pandemic video that was getting a lot of traction at the time, alleging that the pandemic, the COVID was a sort of hoax generated by pharmaceutical companies to make profit. And when she published the article on ABC, it wasn't signed, and that made me, interested. And so I asked her if she'd be okay to be interviewed, and she said sure. And so we discussed this, and yes, it was because she was a bit worried about being pursued by crazy anti-vaxxers or whoever. And but she agreed to be interviewed, and she bravely agreed to be named, and she's bravely here, so we can talk to her as well. Okay, and finally, the last chapter. I'm sorry, this is Kim's comment, which tracks the creation of hashtags and how they spread. So yeah. So you're probably wondering what are all these photos that we've used to illustrate the report? They're taken from the French book, which I have here, which I can show you very briefly. You can't really see it with the thing anyway. It's a book that I stole from my parents. That came out in the 80s, and I took it in France, and it shows a history of how Stalinist, Maoist, also, mainly Stalinist and Maoist, basically ministries of truth organization airbrushed, purged apparatchiks from the photos. So, for example, at the top there, there's a smudge, and that was Trotsky. So they're all on the Red Square, 1919, commemorating the revolution, and Trotsky was smudged out, and there's another one from Kamenev who was also reframed. So we just use that as a sort of way to look back a little bit. So the point I'm trying to make here in this final chapter is that there's reasons for spreading conspiracies and believing conspiracies that are both ideological and psychological, and these two levels overlap. So ideological reasons can be, it's a form of warfare, like what Mike is interested in mainly. It's about foreign influence, foreign interference in a democratic society, and Russian IRA or PRC. There's also a form of subversion on the part of extreme right-wing groups, for example, who use social media to spread anti-Semitic rumors, just like the protocols of the sages of Rhine, the 19th century Tsarist forgery. But then there's also psychological reasons for people believing in in misinformation. There's Lenin playing chess in Capri in exile in 1908, and you can see that progressively some of the people disappeared from the photo. Okay, so a little bit about psychology. Why do we believe things to be true? We make an analytic evaluation. This is an article that was published by Erin Newman, who's in psychology at the ANU. So this is a chapter that's taking different bits from other people and putting them all together. So the credibility of new information stems from diverse factors. So it's about how information feels, that why people believe things, not simply the content. So for example, if you hear something in an unfamiliar accent, it's probably not going to strike you as believable as somebody who speaks exactly like you. And also repeating something incredible over and over and over can overcome barriers such as unfamiliarity. And that's what's been happening in the United States. A lot of affirmation, reaffirmation, and then it becomes the truth. So psychology talks about illusory pattern perception, which is when you make connections between random events. You detect a meaningful connection between things that aren't actually connected. And that's shown to be the case for people who believe in conspiracies. Also, sometimes people who believe in the supernatural. Okay, another reason for wanting to believe in a conspiracy is that it makes you feel unique, different from everyone else. You know something the experts don't know. So I want to go back to the ideology now. There's a long tradition of ideological critique of the media, which is at the center of QAnon and other conspiracies today, is that the media is lying to us. But there's a long critical tradition from the left, from Marx to Lippmann to Alex Carey in Australia, the propaganda model in the 80s, and Chomsky, and saying, that the corporate media is basically filtering information. So what we're suggesting here, today we have an example of this with the news media. I don't know if you watched, I didn't watch it, but there's a brilliant clip of Malcolm Turnbull on Q&A speaking to Paul Kelly about the role of news and Murdoch in spreading, basically misinformation about climate change, etc. in Australia. And the last digital news report showed that people in Australia, people who watch, Sky News, they're much less likely to believe that climate change is a real problem. So just a very quick one. I'm going to pause in a minute, but two final points. So Axel was right there. So I think the key point here in terms of selective exposure, we can build our own environment, information environment. We can select our information, the Daily Me, as Cass Sunshine, etc., etc. However, as I said in Michael's presentation, there's a distinction, very important distinction that was made by Nguyen and Eon a few years ago, and I reproduce here this echo chambers and filter bubbles are not the same thing. Basically, the idea that in a filter bubble, in an epistemic bubble, yes, the information is curated. Yes, it's your friends, it's your platform activity. But if you're presented with attitude challenging content, you'll evaluate it on the merit. You'll evaluate it based on rationality. But in an echo chamber, it's more like a cult, because this information that doesn't agree with you, it's hounded out. It's rejected. You only believe one source of authority. And so I think that's an important distinction that needs to be made. And so how do we reach people in an echo chamber cult, in a community of belief? How do we get to them? They have a different way of assessing what's real. And the suggestion here, the proposal, is to use the ideology, the ideological critique of the media. So yes, sometimes the media, we always say QAnon is baseless, this is baseless. They're not always baseless. There are powerful people who abused children and got away with it, and the media didn't report it. There are pharmaceutical companies who abuse the system and the media doesn't always report it. So you need to form this only works for people you know. But if you can find ideological common ground, then you could maybe try and find epistemological common ground. How do we establish what's real? You have to have a scientific, peer-reviewed connection, not an illusory connection. So that's the proposal that we make at the end of this chapter. I'm not sure what time it is. Oh, I've gone over, sorry. So yeah, I'll open it up to discussion. If there's any questions or comments, please, that would be great. And sorry for going over. Glenn.
Matthew, how do I convince my elderly mother to stop sharing garbage on Facebook? That is really what I need to know. How do I do that? That's the critical question.
You have to start from a position of agreement. You have to start from a position of common definition of something that you can agree on, and from there you can try and build. And it's very difficult. I understand. I mean, it's, you know, it might not be possible, but there's just saying this isn't real is not going to work, because just showing them the facts isn't going to change their point of view.
But she's retired, though. She's like, she's got infinite energy for these arguments. I'm super busy, and I just am slightly impatient with this. It's kind of makes me grumpy. No, it's just a weird. Don't you think there's some weird generational thing going on here?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the survey data does show that, you know, baby boomers and people older are less critical when they access information. They have less media literacy skills, etc., etc. But, you know, I think that there are young people who believe in conspiracies as well. So it's not just an age thing. I see there's something in the chat. Oh, yep, there's a link to the report in the chat. If anybody wants to get it, it's on the APO side. Yep, Kerry? We can't hear you.
I just want to say congratulations, Matthew and Mike. And I suppose what the report shows is the breadth of approaches that are required to tackle the issue. Just taking two of the chapters and starting to try and make some links. Okay, so you've identified Russian trolling in the 2016 election. And then in the final chapter, you've sort of used psychological approaches to understand susceptibility to misinformation. How might those two, and I'm happy here to bring in some of the other authors who've authored some of the other chapters. How might you bring those two together, or what sort of research might be required to bring that, you know, the fact that we know there's the foreign interference and people's susceptibility to that?
Well, my understanding is some of the other authors don't think that the foreign interference is as bad as we say, but I think I've spoken enough, and I'm going to invite, you know, Axel, Rob, Tim, Kelsey, and whoever else, and Mike also to speak and say whatever, respond. I've been speaking a lot. So.
There's some research on countering disinformation, and it's, you know, somewhat of a newish field, but there's some research that's gone on into how people respond to facts challenging their believed assumptions, as well as efforts to help people find common agreement by looking at issues at a higher level of abstraction, such that you can get to points at which they agree about some fundamental needs in political systems, such as moving from that political confrontation of identities and ideologies and interests into more of problem solving, risk assessment, and just figure out how we get things done.
Does anybody else want to say something, not necessarily in response to? I mean, there's another question from Michael Sokolow, who is I'm not sure where you are, Michael, because it's 9 o'clock, so you're in Japan, maybe? Is that where you are? It's a weakness of democracies that we cling. Is it a weakness of democracies that we cling to the ideal of rational critical discourse and persuasion when all the data seems to be showing biased information and motivational effect? Okay, yeah, I guess, but what else have we got? I mean, how can we have a rational democracy if we don't use critical? If they have some sort of emotional democracy, maybe. Rob and Axel, please, do you want to say, or Tim, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'll just quickly chime in that the point that you made, Matthew, in response to Kerry about, I guess there is a bit of, in academia, I think there is still some kind of questions being asked about methods and available data sources, and also even disagreement about whether or not it's a problem at all. and I think you know my kind of take on this. My view is that, I mean, I guess the question I was going to put back to you, Matthew, was, do you think there's an echo chamber about echo chambers? Because that's what some people claim on social media or in academic circles, that in fact there's a lot of hype and even an echo chamber forming around the existence or potential existence and impact of echo chambers.
Yeah, look, I actually reviewed an article for a communication research recently, which basically does a literature review of the literature on echo chambers and blah blah blah. So I think there's a lot of differences in terms of what methods people use, and what we wrote in the report is that there's a big difference between survey-based or interview-based results and network results. Network results are very gung-ho about echo chambers, and they say, like Filippo Mensa in the 2016 article in The Conversation, it's extremely true that, there's a very dense network with no connection to the outside, so misinformation spreads like lightning. And I can see Axel shaking his head, so I'll bring him in. Axel.
Yeah, I might have to jump in there, because I think that's unfortunately the downside of doing this kind of network analysis, because it so often only looks at individual hashtags or individual platforms and completely disregards the fact that these people also live in reality, live in society, and so they are not completely sealed off from views that disagree with them. In fact, many other research also shows that many of the people who are most ideological are also the most active followers of mainstream media, because they need to know what the enemy is thinking and how to engage with it. So the problem here is ultimately a definitional one. You can find networks, and you can find networks that have very strong isolated clusters on individual platforms, but that's still something very different from the metaphor of the echo chamber or the filter bubble, which neither Sunstein nor Pariser ever properly define. So I think the problem here is that we're using these metaphors in a way that stretches them well beyond any kind of sensible use. And ultimately, I think I agree with the point that you ultimately get to at the end of the report, which is that we need to look much more at the psychological kind of aspects of this, and much more at what drives people to so fundamentally reject reality, as they do in the US right now, for instance. But they're doing that in a sense, because they are trying to win a political argument, of course, with the other side. And here, I think, ultimately, what we need to understand is why they are so driven, so cultishly adhering to that particular point of view, and how we might actually de-radicalize them from that. And I think we can actually learn a lot from de-radicalization in other fields here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of literature on debunking with climate change. There's a debunking handbook that's published every year, so we reference that. But yeah, I think the core point is that it's not exposure to information, exposure to attitude challenging content that matters. Yes, like Axel said, people get exposed to all sorts of diverse ideas, but it doesn't mean they're going to accept them or engage with them rationally. It's just propaganda, it's fake news. So how do we break through that is the key question. And of course, it's not such a quick, it's a question, it's an interesting question for us, but it's a life and death question for the United States right now. It's a life and death question, because if you have 70 million people, he's got 70 million votes. How many of those, let's say a quarter of those, or 30 million people who believe that the election was stolen and it's a coup and by the Democrats, that's the roots for civil war. And because I saw a video of a lady who said, what they've done is egregious, it's against democracy, we won't stand. She was sincere. She sincerely believed this. So, sad state of affairs for the United States. Glenn, you wanted to say something, but I think we're running out of time. I think it's a bit unfair when I get half an hour, so I'm willing to sacrifice my 10 minutes to talk about my COVID misinformation research.
So I was going to pose a question, Matthew, just similar logic to your argument about the way in which knowledge is kind of legitimated through networks, your work you did on wikis and stuff, thinking about that kind of performative understanding of information and discourse. So rather than assuming the truth of something or some apparatus by which information circulates because it's true, and there's a kind of contestation where we draw up boundaries and this is my chamber and that's your chamber and like whatever. There's this kind of test of belonging. So it's like a social, you know, connection. So people aren't saying this is true because they think it's the truth. They're saying it's true because they want to belong to the group that thinks it's true, right? So there's this weird kind of performative, you know, kind of dimension to it. So rather than the test of kind of effectiveness is what your argument you made around wikis, you know, that's how we kind of legitimate knowledge. This is like a test of belonging, by which messages circulate. That could be complete garbage. Like half the stuff that's circulating is clearly nonsense, you know, but they still, you know, they will affirm it to belong.
I think that's true, and you know, there's a form of collective identity. But I think that the really great, important point was made by Axel about why do people want to believe in these things. And you always say, you know, it's in a period of constant change, uncertainty. I mean, in the United States, it's clearly driven by racial factors. I think, you know, there's a racial dynamic, and there's people who are, you know, resisting the changes in the United States. But more fundamentally, I think there's a crisis of the democratic system. If the institutions are seen as not, you know, being fair in the way they report, you know, the actions, the news institutions aren't fair in the way they report powerful actors, people will critique that. And this is a critique that's been happening for a long time from the left, but now it's been co-opted by the right. And I think, you know, we have to also see the bigger picture, which is that it's about representative democracy, and you know, there's powerful interests in society who stop certain issues from being discussed. You know, so I think it's a complex issue, but we haven't heard from Tim or Kelsey. I was wondering if you wanted to say anything about, if you had a chance to look at the report, if you're okay. I'll start with Kelsey, if you were okay with the way you were portrayed, and because of, you know, it's kind of stepping out a little bit for you.
Yes, it definitely was a little bit scary to be on the other side of the interview table, I can tell you that much. I was happy with how I was portrayed. I was a little bit concerned that maybe I had said too much, but you know, I ran it past my higher ups, and they actually said that they were quite interested in what I had to say, particularly about you know, thoughts of concern or even tinged with a little bit of fear when you say pitch a story about a topic fraught with misinformation, or you get assigned one and you kind of think, oh, okay, who's gonna come to me with some complaints about this one? But no, I'm just really grateful that I was able to participate. I hope that my perspective, and it is just my perspective, you know, as a someone who's still relatively new to the media industry, you know, I hope that's of value to someone. And
it would be interesting to see if it generates debate at all with your colleagues. If, you know, maybe there's some. No, it hasn't. Yes, has anybody talked to you about it?
Not yet. I only just
Not yet.
this before I'm on an afternoon shift today, so no one's kind of had a chance to talk to me yet at all. But we shall see.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think we're going to have to stop in like 1 minute. So Tim, did you want to say anything? And did you come in and any thoughts on the report or on your article?
Well, I mean, all I'll say is it's great. You know, it's wonderful to be able to collaborate and to contribute something to the report. I mean, you know, having followed all of your work and having had, known each other for quite some time.
I should say Tim used to work at the ANU with Rob, and we used to hang out, so that's fine, yeah. Yeah,
so, yeah, it's great to read the report. Yeah, great to contribute to it. I think there's a lot of kind of complex arguments, coming out of the report and from what we're discussing. And I'll only make the very brief remark that I think this is a really positive sign for the field, that we're not only generating these kinds of civil discourses with each other, but that we're now trying to tease out what's happening to Australia. So, I mean, I'm not going to chime in, given that there's about 17 seconds left for me to talk, to any of the, really interesting, different points that folks are making. But great to contribute, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where things go after this report, and ramping up our response to the
At least the conversation article, I think that should really make a mark.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm kidding. I'm being self-sarcastic. Okay, well, look, I think we're going to have to stop, but I'm sorry it was a bit rushed. I didn't have a timer, so I went over a bit, but really want to thank everybody, you know, Axel, Tim, Mike, particularly Mike. Mike really helped, you know, bring a new perspective, more political science, information warfare oriented. So, you know, it really shaped the whole report. And Kelsey, of course, and Rob, you know, a long time research partner of mine, and, you know, really happy that we, you know, we got some traction with the political class in Canberra with this submission. So hopefully we will get some open source troll busting tools